The construction industry scheme was introduced in the 1970s, early 1970s, because of what was perceived by government and HMRC at the time as a significant loss of revenue that was going on as part of the major motorway building program that was started in the very late 60s and early 1970s. So what happened, predominantly Irish road working gangs came into the UK to build the roads. They all worked on a self-employed basis. They lived and worked in the UK, and consequently they were required to pay income tax, but they were all self-employed. And although they registered for self-employment with the Inland Revenue, it's debatable as to whether they paid any tax, and indeed many would register as Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse, and no one paid any tax. And back in those days, everyone was paid via cash, and in fact, those type of operations were paid for under what was called the lump at the time, and that literally meant the gang master in charge of his road building gang would be paid a lump of cash, and he would distribute it to his workers. So large amounts of tax were not being collected. So government introduced what was called the construction industry scheme, which obligated construction firms or construction contractors who were paying subcontractors to deduct tax from them at a prescribed rate, and therefore pay that tax direct to the revenue. It was then up to the individual subcontractor to offset that payment that was deducted from him against the tax that he owed. So it was a vehicle for government to collect taxation from the construction industry scheme. That's why it exists. The obligations for contractors who work in construction, and I'll just give you a quick definition as to what construction is defined as by the law. So the regulations say that the construction, alteration, repair, extension or demolition of any works forming or to form part of the land, including walls, roadworks, power lines, electronic communication apparatus, aircraft, runways, docks, harbours, etc., etc. Virtually any construction operation you can think of. Also, the installation of heating systems, electrical systems, air conditioning systems are all covered under the construction industry scheme. Contractors are obligated to register with the Inland Revenue if they perform these operations. They are also required to make deductions from the subcontractors that they engage. Now, CIS does not apply to contractors' employees because their taxation is accounted for through PAYE. The contractor must register with the Inland Revenue for the construction industry scheme. The contractor must submit a monthly report telling the revenue what subcontractors he has paid and under what rate he has paid them. The contractor is obliged to verify the status, the construction industry status of the subcontractor with the Inland Revenue before he makes a payment. So when that contractor has a revenue inspection, or indeed, frankly, when his accountant does his accounts for him at the end of the year, the revenue would deem all the payments that contractor has made to subcontractors as the net amount. So there are three levels of deduction within the construction industry scheme. Some subcontractors can be paid gross, so there is no deduction from them. Most subcontractors who are registered within the construction industry scheme are paid at a 20% deduction. Subcontractors who are not registered are subject to a 30% deduction. So the Inland Revenue, if they inspect that contractor who hasn't registered for the scheme, they will say, let's say, for instance, that contractor has made £80,000 of payments to subcontractors. Revenue will say, well, that is the net amount that would have been paid. And even if it was a 20% deduction, they would therefore say, you should have paid £20,000 tax to us. Here's your bill for unpaid CIS. So that contractor would be subject to a significant charge of undeclared and unpaid tax, plus interest and potential penalties as well. So it could be ruinous for a contractor. And if that contractor is not operating as a limited company, is therefore that contractor is potentially personally liable for that tax. And indeed, if he is operating through a limited company, if he has been reckless in his application of tax law, he could still potentially be found liable for that taxation. So there's a huge potential threat to the contractor for not operating the CIS where he is legally required so to do. Now, the implications for the individual self-employed subcontractor are that if the individual subcontractor has not registered for CIS and his contractor is operating CIS correctly, the revenue will tell that contractor to deduct 30% of his earnings from him and pay that money directly to the revenue. And the only way that subcontractor can have access to that taxation money is when he submits his annual tax return at the end of the tax year, and he offsets that deduction that he's already been subject to against the tax he owes. Now, depending on what the earnings level is, that may not be a problem for some. And indeed, most subcontractors who are deducted 20%, they do a simple tax return at the end of the year, which we can help them with. They generally get a rebate of a few £1,000s. It's all done via the web nowadays. And the system is, with reasonable credit to HMRC, pretty painless. You can get advice both on the web or by telephone from the HMRC helpline. So it's pretty straightforward in terms of registration.